Good evening. I'm Doug Lyons, the Superintendent of Schools. The Community Forum this evening is part of a three-part series to collect information and to make an informed recommendation to school committee about later school start times. I am working in conjunction with school committee members that are on the Student Services Subcommittee on this project. The objective for this evening is to hear more about the science behind sleep in adolescence and later start times. We would like to thank Ian McDermott and the WCAT team here this evening. This forum this evening is being recorded by WCAT and is offered real time via Zoom. There will be time at the end for questions, and if you're accessing the meeting via Zoom, you will be able to put questions into the chat at the end of Dr. Owens' presentation. This evening, we welcome Dr. Judy Owens, a renowned sleep specialist who champions later school start times, emphasizing the critical link between adolescent sleep, health, and academic, emotional, and physical well-being. Dr. Owens has practiced pediatric medicine for more than 3 decades. She has specialty training in developmental behavioral pediatrics, child psychiatry, and public health, with a focus on cognitive and behavioral development. Dr. Owens practices and is a senior faculty member at Boston Children's Hospital, as well as a professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Judy Owens. Thank you.
Well, I am really delighted to be here this evening, and I want to thank Mr. Lyons as the superintendent and the school committee for inviting me to come and speak to you this evening, and thank you all for coming out. I'm sure you have a lot of other things in your busy lives to be doing, and so I really appreciate both the audience here in person and on Zoom, and any future audiences for the recording of this presentation. So without further ado, let me talk about what we'll cover. And essentially, there are going to be 4 different parts to this talk. First, we'll talk about what regulates sleep. So what determines whether we're relatively awake, alert, or sleepy, or asleep at any given time of day. And then in particular, what happens in adolescence in terms of sleep regulation, which in and of itself is a very interesting topic that we're just continuing to explore. And then I want to touch on, importantly, what happens when teens, or any of us for that matter, don't get the sleep we need, and why what I call healthy school start times provides a clear solution to what is really a public health problem. And what I've learned over the last 12, 15 years of doing research on this topic is changing the conversation to talking beyond academics and talking about the health and well-being of our adolescents really changes the conversation and makes it particularly more relevant, I think, as we look at these complicated issues. So I want to bore you for a few seconds, or minutes, I guess, with some basics, because I think this is really important to understand, especially as we talk about what happens during adolescence with sleep development. So this somewhat complicated slide, let me break it down. This is what's called the 2-process model of sleep regulation. So at the top with the red arrows, you see what's called the sleep drive. And that is believed to be related to an accumulation of certain neurotransmitters in the brain that actually promote sleepiness. So you can see from the direction of the arrows that when we wake up in the morning, presumably our sleep drive is pretty low, but the longer we're awake, the stronger our sleep drive is until we fall asleep and it gets dissipated throughout a normal night's sleep. Now, sometimes in contrast and sometimes complementing this sleep drive is what we call the circadian drive towards alertness. Now, as opposed to the sleep drive, this particular mechanism has predictable peaks and troughs throughout the 24-hour day. So we all tend to feel a little bit of a slump in the late-ish afternoon between 3 and 5, where we may reach for a cup of Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts. And then we get a surge of alertness called the forbidden zone, or the second wind phenomenon, which is a burst in circadian-mediated alertness that allows us to stay up for an extra hour in the face of that accumulating sleep drive. And then around 3 to 5 in the morning, which we call the circadian nadir, is the lowest point of alertness during the 24-hour day, but most of us are asleep then, so we don't really recognize that profound dip in alertness. The other piece that I want to emphasize, and I will do that throughout this presentation, is that both sleep time and sleep timing are what we call biological imperatives. So we know that there's a master clock, a circadian clock in the brain that regulates sleep and wakefulness. And that is, it needs to be synchronized with light and dark cycles in the environment. But what we also know that every cell in the body possesses a circadian clock, and these all need to be synchronized with one another. So conditions like jet lag or shift work, in which these are not synchronized with the normal light-dark cycles, cause a lot of issues. And so this misalignment results in profound impairment in physiologic function and in general health. And you can see this affects virtually every organ system in the body, and as a result, can result in pathology or disease states, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. The concept of deficient sleep is also important to recognize. We tend to focus a lot on the amount of sleep that we get, but deficient sleep acknowledges that it's more than just short sleep or insufficient sleep in terms of the amount. This circadian misalignment, or the mismatch between the biological circadian rhythms and demands of the environment, when to wake up, when to go to sleep, when to function, and not having a regular sleep schedule. So having a big difference in our bedtime, fall asleep time, and wake time, say between school nights and non-school nights, and poor sleep quality, while all those may be interrelated, they all can contribute to the kind of impairments in health and cognitive performance that I'll be talking about in just a minute. So in other words, it's not just how much you sleep, it's when you sleep and how you sleep that are also critical. I just want to touch very briefly on this concept of sleep health and what kinds of parameters we look at to define good, healthy sleep. And that's certainly satisfaction or subjective perception of the quality of your sleep. Do you feel well rested when you wake up in the morning? How alert you are during the course of the day when you need to be awake and functioning. The timing, the placement of your major sleep period within the 24-hour day. Efficiency, which is the continuity of sleep. So do you stay asleep with perhaps only brief wakings through the course of the night, and then duration? And the reason why these sleep health parameters are important is because we know that they can impact bad health outcomes. And again, I'll talk a little bit more, as well as performance impairments and function. So I like to think about what happens to sleep during adolescence as essentially a perfect storm, and particularly when you couple that with the changes in school start times. Why is that? So number one, all adolescents, as they go into puberty, experience a shift in circadian rhythms. And this is principally based on pubertal development rather than chronological age. And they shift to become essentially night owls. So this results in a biologically based delay or shift to a later natural fall asleep time and a natural wake time. So in addition to that, remember the sleep drive and how that accumulates across the course of the day. The speed of the accumulation of the sleep drive actually slows during adolescence. So these two factors conspire to not only allow, but really create a situation where adolescents are not able to fall asleep as early as they did in elementary school, and they're also programmed to wake up at a later time. So due to these two changes in the two process model, on a practical level, it's very difficult for the average adolescent to fall asleep much before 11 o'clock at night because of that shift in the fall asleep time and wake time. And they can't force themselves to fall asleep earlier than what their biological clock is telling them to do. So if you do the math, in order for a high school student, for example, to obtain the recommended amount of sleep, and that generally is defined as between 8.5 and 10 hours of sleep at night. For a 7:30 school start time, they would need to be asleep at the latest by 9:30. So you can see already we've created a problem because in order to get enough sleep and to be sleeping at the right time, they have to fall asleep at a time which is highly unlikely they'll be able to do, unless they're so exhausted and so sleep deprived, they can fall asleep earlier, but that's not usually the case. Now, I acknowledge, because this always comes up, and I think it's important to recognize that there are behaviors that adolescents engage in, which make this situation even worse and need to be addressed as part of the educational process when you make changes in school start times. So there's all these competing priorities for sleep, right? Those range from after-school activities, homework, employment, social networking, a very, very big deterrent to sleep. And when you think about it, one of the most powerful things that delays your sleep is exposure to light in the evening. The closer to sleep, your bedtime or fall asleep time, the more of a problem that is. And in particular, blue light, which is the light that is emitted from screens, is very potent at shutting down the brain's release of melatonin, the hormone of darkness, the biomarker of the circadian system that is very important in helping us to fall asleep. You start to see melatonin levels increase in the evening and start to peak at around the time that our brains are ready to fall asleep. Now, of course, this delay in the fall asleep time means that teenagers have an even greater exposure to light in the evening, a greater and longer exposure. And so this suppresses the release of melatonin, as I mentioned. And to add to that, at around the time of puberty, teens develop even greater sensitivity to that blue light. So again, this is part of that whole perfect storm scenario. And what are teens doing, including doing homework on the computer, but they're all on their electronic devices. And it's not just the light factor, which is important, very important, but it's the brain stimulation of being on these devices, being on your cell phone, and in particular having these devices in the bedroom and available to you not only at the beginning of the night, but all through the night. And in fact, there was one study that found that just having one of these devices in the bedroom turned off actually caused more disruption to sleep, because just having that potential anticipation of the beep going off, even though the device is turned off, is important as well. And of course, consumption of caffeine and other stimulants. Caffeine is ubiquitous in our society, and many convenience stores sell melatonin-containing products to help you sleep, and then have highly caffeinated products to keep you awake. So you can go either way just by going to your local Cumberland Farms. And I'm sure this energy drinks, this is probably an old statistic, and many of the marketing of these energy drinks is towards adolescents, and they are using them. So what's the temporary solution to this is what we call weekend oversleep or social jet lag. So this is the practice of adolescents trying to make up the sleep that they're not obtaining during the week by sleeping in later on the weekends. And oftentimes there's a whole shift to a later bedtime as well as a later wake time. And remember, the regularity of your sleep schedule is a very important part of healthy sleep. So that's violating that particular rule right there. So if it's someone that I really value, one of my colleagues once said, if you can sleep later, that means you need more sleep. So that is essentially a marker. You know, if your teenager is sleeping till 10, 11, noon on weekends or non-school days, that means they're not getting enough sleep during the week. But that doesn't reverse or compensate for the impairments that are associated with deficient sleep Monday through Friday. So that creates this phenomenon that we call social jet lag, which is this marked shift in bedtime and wake time on non-school days that adds to this circadian misalignment that's already present during the week. And when you think about it, if you sleep until noon or 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday, you're not going to be able to build up enough of a sleep drive to fall asleep at a decent time. And the whole cycle starts all over again. And we know that, for example, for every hour shift in time zone, it takes at least 1 day to accommodate. So if there's a 3-hour shift in bedtime and wake time on Friday night and Saturday, then it's going to take till midweek at least to kind of realign, and then the whole cycle starts all over again. So all of these normal changes in sleep development in adolescence are in direct conflict with earlier school start times. And when I say high school, I'm also going to talk a little bit about middle school, because puberty for many of these kids starts in middle school. And that's when all of these changes in sleep development are starting to occur. So as a result, think about maybe back to that first figure that I showed. That means that students are required to wake up and function at a time which is for them that lowest level of circadian alertness. It's like asking all of us to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and drive ourselves to work, or, you know, do whatever we need to do to function. In addition to that, it's important to remember that what's called REM, or rapid eye movement, or dream sleep, actually occurs in the last third of the night, principally. And so if you have to get up too early before you've gotten your full amount of sleep, that's going to selectively rob you of that particular stage of sleep. And why is that important? Well, we know that REM sleep is critical for learning of new information in particular. So we're setting kids up for failure by virtue of decreasing that critical stage of sleep. And the bottom line is they're not able to meet their sleep needs, which again, for optimal health, safety, and achievement, and of course we all want that for our kids, for our students, for all teenagers. The average middle and high school student needs that 8 to 8.5 to 10 hours of sleep, and they're simply not able to get that when school starts at 7 or 7:30, and I'll talk a little bit more about what the sweet spot seems to be. So why do we care about this? Well, there are a lot of studies now that show that there is a link between deficient sleep, impairment in brain function, that then lead to risky behaviors. So first of all, we have what are called executive functions. And this is housed in a particular area of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which, by the way, is a critical part of the brain that is deficient in individuals with ADHD. So that results in impaired decision-making, poor motivation, poor judgment, lack of impulse control, inattention, inability to inhibit your behavior in anticipating consequences. And not only that, but we now know that these executive functions are at their highest stage of development during adolescence. So you are targeting a particular brain function at a time when it's most vulnerable. Deficient sleep also affects emotional regulation. So individuals are more likely to overreact or to react to negative versus positive stimuli. And in addition, there seems to be a weaker connection related to deficient sleep between the areas of the brain that control emotional regulation and the prefrontal cortex. So you have a higher level of emotional reactivity with less control over it. And then the third factor is what we call impaired reward-related decision-making. So people who do not get enough sleep or have misaligned sleep tend to take more risks because they perceive less in the way of consequences for those risks. So you can imagine that these three factors are going to contribute very importantly to risk-taking behaviors that in turn affect health. Briefly, to touch on obesity risk, for example. We know that that is a significant health concern in adolescents as well, and that there are a large number of studies now that show that deficient sleep, particularly decreased sleep duration, is associated with an increased risk of obesity. Having that evening shift in your natural fall sleep time and wake time is also associated with obesity risk. And there are lots of potential mechanisms for that. We know, for example, that insufficient sleep affects the release of two neurohormones called ghrelin and leptin, which serve to increase our appetite and decrease our sense of being full. There's also effects on insulin function, so there's more insulin resistance. People who have deficient sleep tend to eat more calories, higher calorie foods, higher carbohydrates, higher fat content foods, and it may also affect eating patterns. So we know that if you tend to take more of your caloric intake in the evening rather than in the morning, that's a contributor to obesity risk. And of course, none of these adolescents are eating breakfast in the morning because they're just not hungry, because their brains are still asleep. And if you're too tired to exercise, that's also going to impact your obesity risk, as well as these sleepiness-related impairments in judgment and motivation and planning and impulse control that I just mentioned. We know that short sleep duration is increased with what is associated with what we call increased cardiometabolic risk. So what does that mean? That means things like hypertension, the development of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, And again, that evening chronotype, that shift in normal fall asleep and wake time is also associated, for example, with type 2 diabetes risk in adults. So both, and then to add to this, there's a synergistic effect between insufficient sleep and obesity that add to detrimental health effects in terms of cardiovascular health, metabolic function, and inflammation throughout the body. So one of the things I worry most about is what is going to happen to these kids and their health 20, 30, 40 years down the line after being exposed to insufficient, poor, misaligned sleep for maybe 6 years during a critical period of brain growth and health. And we simply don't know the answer to that, but it scares me and it should scare you. Immune function. We know that there are all kinds of complex relationships between sleep and what we call inflammatory markers. So meaning these are substances that we can measure that cause inflammation throughout the body. So for example, short sleep, particularly in an study in adolescents, showed that there was an increased frequency of common infectious diseases. And short sleep is associated not only with susceptibility to infection, but slow recovery from infection. It also, very interestingly, may be related to a decreased or poor antibody response to vaccines, like hepatitis, for example, or the flu vaccine. Recover from acute injury. So an example of that that's relevant to the adolescent population is what's called mild traumatic brain injury or concussions, which student athletes playing football or soccer may be more subject to. And so concussions are associated with sleep disturbances that can come before, exacerbate, or actually perpetuate some of the consequences that occur with traumatic brain injury, like depression, PTSD, chronic pain, and impair rehabilitation from these injuries. There's also an important bidirectional relationship between pain and sleep, in that deficient sleep can be associated with increased perception of pain, more intense pain, a decreased threshold for pain, and less tolerance to pain, and can worsen pain conditions such as migraine headaches. And there was actually one recent study that looked at the impact on health outcomes of delaying school start times, and one of the outcomes that they looked at was frequency of migraine headaches in adolescents, that they found actually declined in association with a change in school start time. So a real world benefit among many. So unfortunately, the causes of death, of mortality in adolescents in the United States has really shifted dramatically. So the 3 top causes now are accidental injuries, suicide, number 2, and number 3, assault, homicide. So very different from when I was an adolescent, where infectious diseases or cancers or, this has been a dramatic shift. And all of these can be related to sleep. So in terms of motor vehicle crashes, there's lots of data on this. But for example, 2/3 of accidental injury fatalities in adolescents are related to car crashes. And studies have found that a significant percentage of adolescents report what we call drowsy driving, which is just not feeling alert, closing your eyes at stop signs, driving for distances without remembering the particular route. A study that we did found that almost half of our sample reported drowsy driving. And every hour less than 8 hours on school nights was associated with an increased risk of drowsy driving. So that's why we call it drowsy driving, but it's a very serious issue, obviously. In addition to that, this was a very interesting study that was done a few years ago, which was a survey study of injury risk behaviors in adolescence, and which might lead to motor vehicle crashes, for example. So they compared students who got less than 7 hours to those who got at least 9 hours, and they were less likely to wear a bicycle helmet. They were less likely to use a seatbelt. They were more likely to text while driving, to make the decision to ride with a drinking driver or to drive and drink themselves. Remembering back to those executive functions, the poor judgment, the impaired decision-making that lead to these kind of real-world consequences. Sleep loss is also associated with an increased risk of pedestrian injuries and more risk-taking in crossing streets, for example. Here's an important one for student athletes, associated with sports-related and musculoskeletal injuries in adolescence. An almost threefold risk of work-related injuries requiring medical care, so serious injuries, and an increased risk of repeated injuries, potentially something like mild traumatic brain injury. And we know that multiple concussions have an additive effect in terms of brain function. Now, depression and suicidal behavior is extremely concerning, and particularly since the pandemic, there has been increased interest in trying to find solutions to what seems to be an epidemic of depression and suicidal behavior. So we know that chronic sleep loss is clearly associated with mood dysregulation, including depression symptoms. So in this one particular study I quoted, almost 40% of this large sample of high school students were not getting enough sleep, and 40% of those who got 6 or less hours of sleep reported significant depression symptoms. So, you know, we can't ascribe cause and effect, but these multiple studies that show these strong associations are very, very important to pay attention to. And insufficient sleep, and this was a study that I participated in, is associated with increasing trends in suicidal ideation and behaviors in adolescence, something that we have to take extremely seriously. And again, circadian rhythm disturbances and this idea of this shift to an eveningness chronotype, a night owl chronotype, is associated with depression symptoms. But the light at the end of the tunnel are studies that suggest that interventions that target improved alignment between our circadian biology and sleep-wake behavior, like delaying school start times, are a potential mechanism in the relationship between sleep and improvement in depression symptoms. So it's not all gloom and doom in that not enough sleep causes bad problems, but getting enough sleep could decrease these problems. And hopefully I'll show you that in just a little bit. So a very recent review showed that there was a positive association in adolescence between substance use and sleep disturbances in those different parameters that I mentioned of sleep health, like regular sleep, timing, efficiency, duration, and having issues with being sleepy during the day and making poor choices associated with tobacco and alcohol use. But the most common association between sleep that we know so far and substance use in adolescence is short sleep, insufficient sleep. And this is an example. This is called the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is a national survey that's administered to high school and middle school students around the country. So this was reports from 1 year in one particular county. So the high school students, their average weekday sleep duration was 6.5 hours, and 77% reported getting less than 7 hours, and 20% less than 5 hours on school nights. But more than a third of those getting 7 hours of sleep reported use of tobacco, alcohol, marijuana within the previous 30 days versus only 14% with those who are getting 9 hours. And almost 3 times as many students who are getting less than 6 hours of sleep reported using alcohol in the past 30 days compared again to those getting at least 9 hours of sleep. So again, we're talking real world consequences. So what is the relationship and what do we know about how things work with school start times? And this is a wonderful website if you want to know more, and an organization called Start School Later, Healthy Hours. The link is startschoollater.net, and it's a repository of an incredible amount of information, not only the scientific information, but also what school districts around the country and in fact around the world, because this has become a global issue. All around the world, there's concern about what we're doing to our adolescents and their sleep. So a very recent, what's called meta-analysis, which is a very complex assessment or summary of a bunch of different studies, found that increased sleep duration, later rise time, less of that weekend oversleep phenomenon, and decreased daytime sleepiness, as well as improved satisfaction with sleep, has been shown in multiple studies now to be associated with school start time change, specifically delay. Now here we start to get to more of the nitty-gritty of this process. So the most recent information is starting to really reinforce this idea that changes in school start times to between 8:30 and 9 o'clock, or essentially 8:30 or later, are associated with better outcomes across the board than change from 8 to 8:29. So I was one of the authors of the American Academy of Pediatrics policy statement on healthy school start times that was published 10 years ago. And at that point, we advocated for a start time of 8:30 or later based on somewhat limited data. But now the data is really pretty overwhelming that if you can, that is the optimal shift. Now, that's unfortunately, more of the studies have looked at a start time change in schools that started before 7:30, and then they moved to between 8 and 8:30 rather than to the ideal timing of later than 8:30. But nonetheless, compared to the reality, less than 18%, this was a few years ago, but I don't think, maybe with the exception of California, shifting their statewide school start times to 8:30 or later for high school students, less than 18% of US schools started at that optimal time, with most starting at 8 on average, and 42% of schools starting earlier than that. So what do we see, again, as some of the drill down outcomes related to sleep of delaying school start times? So one of the arguments I've heard many, many times is, well, if school starts later, they'll just stay up later and they won't get any more sleep. And that's actually not true. That has been shown in many studies now, that bedtimes remain about the same, maybe shift by something less than 10 minutes, but they then obtain that additional sleep associated with the delay in morning wake-up time related to delays in school start times. So students get more sleep, they get more of that critical morning sleep that I mentioned, and the later the start time, the more sleep they get. I mean, that's sort of a no-brainer, but it's been borne out by multiple studies. Students also report being less sleepy during the day, less falling asleep in class, falling asleep doing homework. And so it looks like that 8:30 or later is kind of the sweet spot that helps students get the amount of sleep they need and avoid this misalignment with the circadian system. So it has two very, very powerful effects. In terms of school performance, we see increased attendance rates, a decrease in absenteeism, a decrease in tardiness. Even studies have shown a decreased dropout rate before and after the implementation of a later school start times, which means increased graduation rates. The data on academic performance in terms of grades is a little bit harder to tease out, but it certainly looks like first period grades, as you might imagine, would be significantly improved because the students are actually awake. Some studies have shown an increase in GPA and even higher standardized test scores. In terms of health and safety, delays in school start times are associated in study after study after study with improved mood and less depressive symptoms. Also with health outcomes like decreased visits to the health center, the nurse's office, improved nutrition, like more likely to eat breakfast in the morning and more likely to make healthy food choices. And these statistics about car crashes, to me, are just such a potent example of how this is a public health intervention. So an old study that in Kentucky years ago looked at a district which changed their school start time from 7:30 to 8:40. And the percent of teens involved in car crashes in that particular county decreased by 16%, but went up by 9% in the rest of the state. The second study compared adolescent crash rates in two very similar districts in Virginia, one of which started at 7:20 and the other at 8:40, and found that it was a 40% higher car crash rate in the earlier starting school district. A CDC study about 10 years ago found reductions in crash rates in adolescent drivers related to delays in school start times by as much as 65 to 70%. And a study which we did in Fairfax County, Virginia, showed that there was a significant decrease in crash rates when Fairfax County changed or delayed their high school start time compared to a slight increase in the rest of the state, which we looked at. None of those other counties had changed their start time, which represented some 126 fewer crashes. So just very briefly to touch on middle school, because there's also studies which show exactly the same positive outcomes when we're talking about middle school start times. So again, we see the same sort of pattern of the later the start time, and especially if it's 8:30 or later, the more positive outcomes. Students got more sleep, especially when it was later than 8:30. And they also compared earlier start time schools versus later start time schools and found those same differences in total sleep time. And middle schools that started before 8 have been associated with more daytime sleepiness. And you see similar improvements in tardiness, less affect and mood dysregulation, less depressive symptoms, less anxiety, less perceived stress by students, and less engagement. This was an interesting outcome in behavioral and verbally aggressive actions as reported by the school. Some studies showed an improvement in grade point average, but overall, we see the same relationship between early versus later middle school start times and worse sleep, behavioral health, and academic performance outcomes. So I just share a little bit of additional benefits from several studies. This was a middle school that changed their start time later by 40 to 60 minutes, high school by 70 minutes, and elementary school in what's called the flip mechanism, where some, because of busing issues, some districts have essentially flipped the elementary school start time with the high school start time. So parents woke up later, were more likely to get enough sleep and good sleep quality, and were less tired. That's nice, with minimal impact on the elementary school parents, who, which you might not have expected. Teachers were able to get up later, got more sleep by an average of about 20 plus minutes, improved daytime functioning, and similarly, the elementary school teachers did not report any decline in their sleep or daytime functioning. So everybody benefits, which is very nice. This was a very interesting study, and I'm almost done here, which was conducted by the RAND Corporation. And what they did is what's called macroeconomic modeling, which I have no idea what that actually means, that what would happen across the US if school start times were changed to 8:30 from wherever they were earlier than that, and found that the benefits from an economic standpoint far outweighed the immediate costs. So the costs would include things like infrastructure changes, lighting playing fields, perhaps having to add more buses and bus drivers. Each district is a little bit different, but they sort of averaged this. And what they saw as the positive outcomes of that theoretical intervention was projected student lifetime earnings as a result of increased high school graduation rates, university attendance, plus a reduction in car crashes in adolescence. So during the 15-year period that they estimated these costs versus benefits, the average gain annually to the US economy would be about over $9 billion a year. And some states, like Massachusetts, were we to do this on a statewide level, would actually break even, it was projected, after 2 years. So this study suggested that delaying school start times to 8:30 or later was a cost-effective, population-level strategy that could have a significant effect on public health and the US economy. So we had a little bit of a natural experiment during the pandemic, right? When kids were home, virtual learning. There were a lot of problems with that. But when we looked at sleep, we saw that sleep schedules, bedtime to a certain extent, but wake time in particular, shifted later. And almost all the studies reported that adolescents got more sleep as a result. Less daytime sleepiness, more regular sleep, less social jet lag. And this evidence is maybe a little bit of additional data to suggest that when you eliminate some of these constraints around student sleep, they get more sleep and they do better. So just some practical considerations to close with. What can schools do? Well, obviously, you're here for a discussion starting about setting healthy school start times, but also including sleep as a part of student health education, including in biology classes. Helping students to manage their schedules so they can get to bed earlier, which also oftentimes increases a discussion about decreasing homework burden, and thinking about buffering those early start times by setting limits on evening activities in school, as well as early morning, late evening athletic practices. Not always possible, but something to put into the mix. Working with employers to decrease adolescent work hours, if possible. Now, I know that there are financial issues for a lot of families, and including drowsy driving in driver ed. What parents and teens can do, know what deficient sleep in a teenager looks like. And I hope I've given you enough information to make that determination. Minimizing as much as possible this wildly irregular difference between school night sleep patterns and non-school nights. Certainly limiting electronic evening use and devices in the bedroom, setting limits on after-school activities and jobs, keeping track of caffeine use, monitor drowsy driving. One of the few things we can hold over adolescents' head, no Z's, no keys. Provide a sleep-friendly home environment and making sleep a priority. And I'll just share with you a few lessons that I have taken away from working with many, many schools high schools, middle schools, and school districts around the country. So superintendent support and leadership is absolutely critical, as well as the school board involvement in this decision. And school leadership principals and teacher support is vital in making this successful process. And if you're going to make changes in middle school or elementary school schedules, you also need to involve that leadership as well. Engaging students, critical role of community education, as you all are here tonight, and community engagement. So who are the key stakeholders in this whole process of making this change successfully? I think it's absolutely critical to allow adequate time for families to know about what's going to happen once the decision is made, and to have time to make sufficient plans for changes in work schedule or childcare or whatever they need to do to make adjustments in their own families. Every community has unique challenges and unique priorities, but you also don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are many, many districts now around the country that have done this successfully, and very, very, very few have gone back to an earlier start time. Not all students will benefit equally, but you want to follow the maxim of providing the greatest good for the greatest number of students. Over and over again, I have heard students, teachers, parents say that the anticipation of this change and what terrible things were going to happen or challenges were going to be associated was much worse than what the reality turned out to be. And that, to a certain extent, actually a large extent, involves careful planning in anticipation of what some of those challenges might be, and that they are reduced over time. So I appreciate your attention. Hopefully I kept everybody somewhat awake. Go forth and make good decisions for the best, in the best interests of your students. Thanks.
So if people have questions, we have a microphone.
We do have several questions from people.
That'd be great.
Dominic, if we would go with the first one from online.
Can you hear me out there?
Yep.
Is that loud enough? All right. All right. Some of these were sprinkled kind of throughout the presentation and were touched upon throughout, but definitely a reiteration I'm sure would be nice. But I will read the first one. The first one was, will you be sharing the impact of earlier start times for elementary students, as that is the likely scenario to allow late start times? How do you remedy the fact that both the American Academy of Pediatrics and the CDC say elementary age students need the most sleep of any adolescent group?
Well, that's certainly true, that the optimal sleep amounts in elementary school students is higher than that of middle school and high school students. And there need to be parameters on if you're enlisting the flip schedule, where or as a result of the need for multiple busing routes, you move elementary school times earlier. So what I would say about that, there's less evidence about what the optimal start time is for elementary school students. But it looks like it's somewhere between probably 7:30 and 8:30. Now, you have to remember that elementary school students have what's called an advanced or morningness chronotype. So it's kind of the opposite of what you see happening during adolescence. They go to bed, they can fall asleep earlier, and they tend to wake up earlier. So if any of those three groups, elementary, middle, and high school, they're the ones that should go first, should go earliest. But when these changes got made back in the 1960s, and that was a result of baby boomer generation and this huge influx of students that then needed busing, multiple busing times and routes. And so the thinking at that time was, well, we'll just have the older kids go earlier and the younger kids go later. And that kind of became entrenched when in fact it should be just the opposite. But there are limitations, of course, on how early elementary schools should start as well. But the few studies that have been done on this, and I quoted one there about the parents and the teachers of elementary school students when their start time was made earlier, didn't see any detrimental effects. Studies have also suggested that the students, the kids, don't see any detrimental effects with an earlier start time, partly because they are capable of falling asleep earlier. So it's easier to manipulate bedtimes for elementary school students than it is for middle and high school students. So that's not a complete answer. I think we have to be careful. One of the biggest thing that derailed Boston public schools from changing their high school start times, delaying it, was the outcry of elementary school parents. And in some ways, I think the communication was really badly handled. And I think it didn't have to be the disaster that it turned out to be. And again, a cautionary tale that if you're going to manipulate the other students' start times and end times, that you have to get the input and involvement of those stakeholder groups as well.
Okay. The next question is, in your research and studies, were start times the only variable? If the students in the studies had different socioeconomic backgrounds, different levels of technological access, then you cannot attribute any impact to start times. Yes. In your research and studies, were start times the only variable? If the students in the studies had different socioeconomic backgrounds, different levels of technological access, then you cannot attribute any impact to start times.
The impact on different ethnic minority groups, perhaps, and income groups. Yeah, well, I'm glad that was brought up because the studies that have looked at that, differences across socioeconomic status and ethnic and minority status, actually show that disadvantaged students tend to benefit more from these changes. I think we still don't have a complete understanding of why that is, but I think now there is quite a bit of evidence to suggest that they benefit as much, if not more, from these changes that delay in school start times. And I think that's a very important question. The other variable that I think we don't know enough about is special needs students who, and that includes students who need additional academic support or have medical concerns or behavioral concerns. But, and we need to take a very hard look at that population of students as well. But the evidence that's out there thus far does not suggest that there is a detrimental effect on those groups of students either.
Before we continue on with the chat questions, does anybody in here have a question? I have one down front. 1 second, please, so everybody can hear you. Sorry, the joys of Zoom.
So I heard that last question as the impact of third variables on the association between sleep and things like depression or test scores and things like that. So did they rule out the impact of those types of third variables that may be associated with sleep and something like depression? Or both at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that's an important question that we probably don't have. I mean, a lot of these studies have tried to control for those kinds of confounding variables to the best of their ability. You know, and some of it is related to the fact that in a lot of studies, it's self-report data. So although there are more and more studies now that actually use devices analogous to a Fitbit to actually measure the amount of sleep that these kids are getting before and after the change. But I think as much as we can control for those other variables that may impact the outcome, studies have not shown a different result after controlling for those variables, if that makes sense. Okay.
Okay.
Oh, one more?
So, one attendee said, you have referenced a lot of studies. Will you be citing them anywhere? Were they peer-reviewed studies, medical, sociological studies? So there's more so wondering where you're getting your sources from, and will you be showcasing it?
Could you repeat that again, please?
Yes.
What? Sorry.
Have you, okay, let me see here. Let me get back there. You have referenced a lot of studies. Will
Yeah.
you be citing them? Were they peer-reviewed studies, medical, sociological studies?
I'm not sure exactly how to answer that. Well, I would say, you know, some of the studies that I showed that showed outcomes on health, like metabolic dysfunction, cardiovascular health, those are medically based, if you will, studies. A lot of these studies are done by epidemiologists who study large populations. You know, some of these studies in terms of looking at adolescent sleep have included more than 50,000 subjects. So those are very large scale studies. The studies, most of the studies of the impact of school start times, I would say, are done by sleep researchers like myself, who may be, many of which are MDs, some of which are research psychologists, a few, some by sociologists and educators, which I think are an important group of researchers that have a little bit different perspective on outcomes and have largely reported on academic outcomes, things like attendance rates, dropout rates, graduation rates, that kind of thing. So the disciplines involved in doing these studies are very broad. The RAND study that I mentioned was done by economists. So there's, you know, and they're all finding complementary results, which to me is very powerful. These are groups of researchers who come from very different backgrounds, who oftentimes are using different methodologies in order to study these outcomes, and they're all coming to very similar conclusions. And that's what I think, you know, this started to be studied back in the 1980s. So we now have a long experience with information that is gleaned from this broad spectrum of researchers. And I think that is very important in giving a sense of the depth and breadth of the science that supports this. I think I'm going to end on that. That was a pretty good ending, right?
So thank you very much, Doctor. Appreciate
You're
it.
very welcome.
And so this is a recorded event. So if you'd like to reference it again, it will be on WCAT. Again, this is the first of 3 forums. And our next few forums, the next 2 forums, the dates have not been published yet. They will be coming out in the next few weeks, the dates for this forum 2 and 3. And so the outcome that we are working on is making a recommendation, likely in February, to school committee, probably around 2 scenarios or 3 scenarios that might be able to be adopted here in Wakefield. So that's what we're working toward. We're far from done. There's plenty of things that we need to look at. And so this is just step 1. We're really starting with the science behind sleep and the importance of this work. So thank you very much for coming out. Much appreciated. Thank you.